My parents fired me from the business I rebuilt with my own savings just to hand it back to my brother, who'd already run it into the ground. Then they called me just an employee. They had no idea what I'd do next. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Growing up, George got new cars, vacations, and our parents' endless praise, while I was told to toughen up and send to live with my grandparents. Birthdays were a reminder. I got socks, he got cash. I worked part-time since 16, while he coasted, despite it all. I believed if I worked hard enough, they'd notice. I clung to that belief for years, like a fool. After college, I took a job in another city while George partied and crashed cars. When the family business floundered, my parents called me home. I moved back, thinking they'd finally value my effort. I slept in the dusty guest room and worked 12-hour days. I thought every late night, every strategy I built, would earn their trust. Instead, George was busy finding himself and somehow still their pride. When the first profits rolled in, I expected praise. My mom said, "Your brother's lucky to have such a dedicated team." George hadn't shown up for a single meeting. I bit my tongue, thinking results would speak louder. I poured everything into streamlining operations. George took credit on social media, posing in front of my charts. My dad smiled. I felt a knot tighten. Was I just the shadow propping him up? At a shareholder dinner, George stumbled through a speech I wrote. He called our new logistics partner Larry instead of Laura. I smiled tightly as guests chuckled. Later, Dad whispered, "Let him shine. He needs this." I stood there, invisible in my own success. "Evelyn," my grandmother squeezed my hand under the table. "You don't need their spotlight to matter," she said. Her words stayed, even when the room refused to see me. George skipped another strategy meeting, claiming creative burnout. I suggested reallocating his salary to cover new hires. Dad snapped, "That's your brother," as if that justified incompetence. I spent nights redoing his tasks. Helen, my mother, brought him lunch and called me obsessive. Evelyn left a book on my desk at the gift of being unseen. It felt like a quiet nudge. I read it between 2M spreadsheets, wondering if invisibility was my curse or strength. George started flirting with Laura during meetings, derailing discussions. When I asked him to stop, he said I was jealous. I reported it privately to my parents. They laughed, said Laura should feel flattered. The next day, Laura resigned. I felt sick. We lost a key partner, and George bragged she had a crush. Evelyn's face hardened. One day, she said, "They'll learn what happens when you build on rot." I started planning my exit. Our quarterly pitch was days away. George forgot key financials and shrugged. "You got this, right?" I stayed up 3 nights rebuilding the presentation. Helen sent him to a spa for mental health. Dad said I was too intense. I delivered the pitch solo. It was a success. George took a selfie with the client. I smiled for the photo, then went back to my desk. My reflection in the glass looked tired and alone. George started leaking project ideas to his influencer friends. One pitched our concept online before we launched. I brought it up. Dad accused me of paranoia. "Evelyn checked the timestamps. He's cashing in on your mind," she muttered. Still, my parents insisted it was coincidence. I began documenting everything, every file change, every email. I felt like a spy in my own office. But I wasn't crazy. I was preparing for the storm ahead. One afternoon, George locked me out of the shared server. "Oops, must have been a net glitch," he smirked. I spent hours recovering files. When I brought it up, Helen said I was too controlling. Evelyn offered to fund my own venture. I hesitated. Loyalty still clung like a chain. But each smirk from George chipped away at it. I wasn't imagining things. I was being pushed out, one silent cut at a time. Our biggest client requested I lead the next rollout. George intervened, saying he'd handle it solo. The client was livid when he fumbled every detail. I salvaged what I could. Later, George yelled at me, privately blamed me for undermining him. Dad said we needed to let him grow. Evelyn watched silently. That night, I backed up all critical files to a private drive. I wasn't waiting for approval anymore. I was building my exit. At the annual company dinner, Dad announced George would be taking full executive control. Applause followed. I sat frozen, and no warning, no credit, just a passing mention of my early contributions. Evelyn raised her glass to me alone. My hands shook as I clapped politely. Afterward, Dad said, "It's time you took a step back." That was my cue. I left without dessert, files secure in my car, stomach hollow with final clarity. The next morning, my access badges didn't work. Her said the system was reorganizing. George texted, "Take the hint, bro." I walked out quietly. Evelyn waited in the parking lot. "They made their choice," she said. I nodded. That afternoon, I registered my own LX. Same industry, cleaner ethics. My inbox held contacts from 3x clients already asking if I was free. The betrayal stung, but momentum had a strange comfort. I was already moving. Helen called a week later. "We didn't fire you, it's just a transition," she said. I asked if I still had a role, supportive advisor, she replied. I hung up. Evelyn laughed bitterly. "You're not their son, you're their safety net." I felt the final thread snap. No title, no salary, just a glorified backup plan. I erased their server access from my cloud backups. My past life closed like a folder. I never reopened it. George launched a flashy campaign using old data I'd shelved for flaws. It backfired immediately. A vendor sent me screenshots of his meltdown. Dad emailed, asking if I'd consult just once. I didn't reply. Evelyn sent me a pie. No note, just a smiley face drawn in crust. That week, I signed my 5th client. Watching their ship sink without me brought a strange peace. Not revenge, just release. Their chaos was no longer my storm. Helen showed up at my office unannounced. "We're struggling," she admitted. I asked what she wanted. "Your help," she whispered. I stared at her. She looked older, frailer. But the silence that followed wasn't mine to fill. I nodded toward the door. "I don't work for free." Evelyn watched from her desk, expression unreadable. As the door clicked shut, she said, "You gave them enough." I finally believed it. Their emergencies were no longer mine. George posted a teary video claiming I'd abandoned family. Comments roasted him. One read, "Didn't he steal your brother's job?" I didn't reply. The internet did it for me. Evelyn printed it, framed it on her desk. I laughed for the first time in months. Not because he failed, but because I didn't have to speak. I was done justifying my exit. They'd burned the bridge. I simply stopped standing on it. Clients started mentioning George's spiral, missed meetings, inflated invoices, weird crypto pitches. I smiled, offering stable alternatives. Helen emailed again, "Let's talk." I deleted it. Evelyn caught me staring at my old family photo. "Don't mourn people who only saw your usefulness," she said. I replaced the picture with my company's first team shot. Everyone smiling, no hierarchy, no shadows, just progress. That night, I slept without checking emails. No damage control, just calm. Dad left a voicemail. "He's ruining everything, you were right." He didn't apologize, just panicked. I forwarded it to Evelyn. She replied with a thumbs up emoji. I didn't respond. That weekend, I launched our new product line. Press coverage called it the comeback of a quiet genius. I didn't correct them or let them wonder. I wasn't back, I was finally seen. No drama, no begging, just earned respect in a world I built myself. George tried copying our product. Clients noticed instantly. One posted side-by-side screenshots online. It went viral. "Imagine stealing and still failing." The caption read. I didn't laugh. I sent my team cupcakes. Evelyn added, "Hadn't filed yet." I nodded. This time, I protected my work. Helen sent flowers with a card, "Proud of you." I tossed it. Pride that arrives post-betrayal is just decoration. The real prize was the silence after. No more apologies, just distance. Evelyn organized a private dinner, just us. She toasted to freedom, finally earned. I choked up. No pity, no lecture, just quiet respect. She handed me an envelope, the deed to her old workshop. "Now my satellite office. Build something no one can take," she said. I promised I would. That night, I stared at the stars from the porch, not chasing anyone's approval, just feeling the gravity of having nothing to prove to anyone anymore. 2 weeks later, I watched from a distance as the family business's front windows were papered over, foreclosure notice taped to the glass. George stood inside, pacing. Helen clutched her phone, face pale. I didn't gloat. I didn't approach. Evelyn joined me at the curb. "You're not there," she whispered. "Not anymore." I nodded. That was the closure. Not revenge, not collapse, just walking away without turning back. Peace isn't loud, it's simply quiet, and mine now. George filed a lawsuit claiming I stole proprietary data. I laughed. Everything I used was mine. Logged, time-stamped, and backed up. My attorney sent over a binder within days. Their lawyer withdrew. Still, the smear hit online. A fake Reddit thread accused me of sabotage. I tracked the IP. It was George. Evelyn posted the receipts publicly. Silence followed. The twist: I didn't lift a finger. I'd built a life so transparent. Lies had nowhere to land. Helen called again, sobbing. "We mortgaged the house to save the company. Now it's gone." I didn't flinch. "You chose your golden boy," I said. She begged to meet. I declined. She asked if Evelyn had poisoned me against them. I nearly laughed. Evelyn didn't poison, she witnessed. And she stayed when they didn't. That's the twist. Loyalty isn't loud, it's consistent. And when trust is broken long enough, even the softest silence becomes a boundary. An old employee from our family firm joined my company. She brought a flash drive. George had duplicated my systems and pitched them overseas. The files were sloppy, plagiarized, and traceable. I sent a cease and desist. George vanished from LinkedIn. Helen emailed, "Please don't ruin him." I replied, "I didn't need to. That's the twist. They taught me to survive. But they never learned to." I walked through fire. He lit matches with gasoline hands. Not my problem. The bank auctioned off the old family office. Evelyn bought it quietly and handed me the keys. For archives or coffee, she said. I turned it into a free business incubator for local startups. Former clients walked in, wide-eyed. This used to be they'd start. Now it's new, I'd answer. The twist to healing didn't come from payback, it came from repurposing the ruins. From turning a monument to neglect into a lawn pax for someone else's first chance. A viral podcast mentioned my story. The guy who rebuilt everything, got tossed, and still rose higher. They didn't name names, but people guessed. Helen tried calling again. I blocked her. George messaged from a new number. You win, happy now, but I wasn't playing. That's the final twist. They thought life was a scoreboard. I was never competing. I was reclaiming peace, and peace isn't a prize. It's what grows after you stop watering someone else's roots. An anonymous email arrived. You deserve better. Attached was a scanned journal George's, abandoned in a desk drawer. Entries mocked me, detailed sabotage, bragged about gaslighting. I sent copies to the family lawyer and archived the rest. Evelyn read a page, then burned the journal in her fireplace. It's not truth, she said. It's proof of rot. The real twist, I didn't need to use it. Closure isn't leverage, it is knowing the whole story and walking away anyway. At a conference, a former investor approached me. Your brother pitched the same idea years ago. You made it work. I nodded, unsure what to say. You're the one we remember, he added. That stayed with me. Reputation wasn't about press, it was about patterns. And people had been watching all along. The twist? I hadn't been invisible, I'd been underestimated. Turns out, that's the best disguise for someone planning to build an empire from scraps. George tried hosting a workshop, branding himself as a resilience expert. Only 5 people showed. One recorded him fumbling buzzwords. Posted it with the caption, Nepo Flop teaches failure by example. It blew up. I didn't react publicly, but Evelyn emailed me the clip titled Comedy Gold. The real twist, I didn't feel triumph, I felt done. He'd built a stage on borrowed glory. And when the lights dimmed, there was no foundation, just ego and echoes. An industry panel invited me, keynote speaker, topic, building from betrayal. I hesitated. Evelyn said, share the scars, not the scabs. I spoke about value, erasure, and the illusion of family loyalty. No names, just lessons. Afterward, a young woman hugged me, crying. That was my dad too, she whispered. That's the twist, what broke me, built bridges. Pain had taught me strategy, but survival made me generous. That night, I slept easier, not healed, but finally whole. Years later, Evelyn passed. Her will left everything to me, but it wasn't the property, it was her notes, margins scribbled with encouragement. Keep going, they see you. I framed her handwriting in my office. One line stayed with me, you were always enough. They just weren't looking. The final twist, I didn't just outgrow my past. I inherited a future built by someone who always saw me. Sometimes, legacy isn't blood, it's clarity written in ink. One day, I passed my parents in the grocery store. They looked older, smaller. We locked eyes. Helen opened her mouth, then closed it. George avoided my gaze. I nodded politely. Nothing more. No anger, no need. The twist, closure didn't come in words, it came in distance, in standing tall without needing explanation. As I walked away, I realized I didn't crave acknowledgement. I'd built a life too big to fit in their silence. My younger cousin messaged me, thank you. You surviving made me brave. She'd left the family firm, joined my company. At lunch she said, you were the whisper that said, you're not crazy. That was the twist. Legacy wasn't just survival, it was permission for others to choose better, walk away sooner, heal deeper. Evelyn had done that for me. Now I was doing it for her and others. The cycle didn't just break, it bloomed. A reporter called, asking to feature my story, the son who outgrew his father's empire. She pitched. I declined. Not out of fear but principle. My story didn't belong to their headlines. It belonged to those rebuilding in silence, after being discarded. That's the twist, I wasn't the scandal. I was the aftermath. Quiet, resilient, permanent. And sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones no one gets to exploit. Just live and leave fully. An old mentor invited me to guest lecture. Afterward, a student asked, what was the turning point? I said, when I realized love without respect is just control. Silence fell. The professor nodded. The twist, truth doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to be clear. I never told my parents that line, but I lived it. Every policy I wrote, every culture I built, it whispered the same thing: people thrive where they're truly seen. George was spotted working retail under a pseudonym. A client sent me a blurry photo. I deleted it. Not out of pity but irrelevance. His fall wasn't my arc. I didn't need a rival to stay focused. Evelyn once said, he was your mirror until you stopped reflecting him. That was the twist. Real freedom wasn't rising higher. It was walking sideways, out of his shadow. My journey wasn't upward, it was away, and it was enough. An unexpected letter arrived from my dad. No apology, just updates. Your mom's health is failing. George left town. We hope you're well. I read it twice, then burned it. Evelyn had once said, they only reach when they fall. I had climbed, not to escape but to rebuild. That letter wasn't a bridge, it was bait. The twist I no longer needed to explain why I wouldn't bite. My silence was louder than any reunion. I hired a therapist to run sessions for my staff. One asked, what made you value mental health? I didn't flinch. Being gaslit for years, I answered. Laughter broke the tension. The twist, transparency isn't weakness. It's armor. Our culture shifted, people spoke freely, took breaks, asked questions. I'd spent decades in silence. Now I funded clarity, and every open door I built was a silent vow no one else would climb through fire just to feel seen. At a networking gala, a stranger said, you're Nolan Pierce, right? Your story helped me quit a toxic firm. I shook his hand, stunned. The twist, I'd never told it publicly, but people whispered, shared, saw. Evelyn once said, your light leaks even when you're not aiming it. I finally understood. I hadn't rebuilt for revenge, I'd rebuilt for reflection. And when others saw themselves in my healing, the legacy grew beyond my name, quiet, real, lasting. An old photo resurfaced, me, George, and Dad. I barely recognized the man in it, eye-searching, shoulders curled. I printed it and drew a line down the middle. Left side then right side, now my team smiling, holding awards. I framed it in the lobby. Modest spite as proof of growth. Evelyn's quote underneath, some roots rot, others anchor. That was the twist. I don't need to hide the past. I just refused to live in it. George's name trended again, this time for defrauding a small nonprofit. He'd pitched a fake app, took donations, disappeared. I didn't speak out. A journalist called me for comment. I said, no involvement. That was the twist. I no longer needed to defend myself against his shadow. His spiral wasn't mine to map. And finally, people stopped asking. Because when someone burns every bridge, the only story left is smoke. And I was living in daylight now. A magazine featured rising entrepreneurs and included me. The photo showed my new office, bright, modern, nothing like the old one. Helen mailed a copy, underlined my name, wrote finally proud. I returned it unopened. Evelyn once told me, pride too late is grief in disguise. The twist wasn't in their regret, it was in my peace. Recognition after abandonment doesn't warm. It chills. I'd already built warmth elsewhere with those who never needed convincing. A high school teacher invited me to speak to seniors. What would you tell your younger self? She asked. I said, stop asking how to earn love. Start asking what love should look like. The students nodded. One girl whispered, I needed that. The twist, healing doesn't echo in grand speeches. It lands in quiet moments, in a hallway, in a tear, in someone else's beginning. Evelyn had whispered truths, now I passed them forward, quietly loud. At a mentorship panel, someone asked, what's your proudest moment? I paused, not flinching when they begged for help. I said. The room went still. I added, because forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's releasing the grip. That was the twist. I hadn't crushed them. I'd let go, and letting go didn't make me cold, it made me clear. Evelyn's note rested in my wallet, peace over performance. I finally lived those words, not to win, but to breathe. I visited Evelyn's grave on her birthday. Fresh flowers, my company pin clipped to the ribbon. I sat quietly, updating her aloud, new hires, grants, laughter in the break room. You were right, I whispered, about everything. A breeze rustled the trees, no signs, no ghosts, just clarity. That was the twist. The people who truly see us don't haunt, they anchor. And even in absence, her voice still steadied me, not as memory, as foundation. A new intern asked, is it true you built this after losing everything? I smiled. I didn't lose everything, just illusions. The room chuckled. Evelyn had once said, loss clears fog. That was the twist. What looked like collapse was just clarity, removing noise. Every ruined title, every fake praise, they weren't stolen, they were returned. Because I was never meant to carry their weight. I wasn't reborn from ashes, I simply stepped out of the smoke. Someone once told me, you're too soft for business. They were wrong. I wasn't soft, I was strategic. Gentle doesn't mean weak. Empathy doesn't mean easy. Evelyn knew that. She built with care and outlasted them all. The twist, I didn't win by being harder. I won by refusing to be hardened, and that difference between armor and awareness is what kept my company human and thriving. Sometimes, power wears kindness like steel, quiet, steady, unbreakable where it matters. I visited the city archives, checking zoning for expansion. A clerk recognized my name. Your family used to own downtown, she said. I nodded. Now we're just building forward. She smiled. That was the twist. My name no longer echoed legacy. It sparked curiosity, not who I came from, but what I stood for, and that shift from inheritance to intention meant everything. I wasn't continuing a bloodline, I was creating a blueprint, one blueprint at a time. An award ceremony named me Industry Builder of the Year. I accepted with a short speech. Everything you see was once dismissed, including me. Applause rose. I didn't cry, but I felt Evelyn beside me. That was the twist. Every time they silenced me, I wrote plans. Every time they mocked, I strategized. And now, every floor, every desk, every voice in my company, that's the real legacy. Not survival, not revenge, just building in broad daylight, a podcast asked. If you could go back, would you forgive them sooner? I paused. Forgiveness isn't time, it's clarity. And clarity takes what it takes. The twist, I never rushed healing. I let it arrive, slow and uneven, like sunrise through fog. And when it came, it didn't erase pain. It reframed it. Every late night, every ignored effort, they weren't wasted. They were seeds, and forgiveness wasn't water. It was the decision to grow anyway. A child of one of my employees drew our office and handed me the crayon picture. This is where Daddy smiles, she said. I thanked her, framed it next to our first blueprint. That was the twist. Legacy wasn't cash or fame. It was how people feel when they walk through your doors. I couldn't fix my past family, but I'd built a better one. Not perfect, but honest, and sometimes that's more than enough. One late night, I stayed behind alone. Evelyn's quote above the exit read, "Build where no one can take." I touched it. Her absence still stung, but her presence lingered, etched into every kind decision, every silent boundary kept. The twist wasn't in escaping my family. It was in recognizing who's always been mine, chosen, trusted, rooted. I turned off the lights, stepped into the quiet. No ghosts, no echoes, just peace and the click of my own keys. As the year ended, I wrote a letter not to my family, but to myself. You did the work. You told the truth. You walked away. I sealed it, placed it in a drawer labeled Legacy. That was the final twist. I never needed their apology. I needed my own affirmation. And now I had it, written, earned. Lived. Closure wasn't an event. It was every step I'd taken alone. Now walked by others with clearer footsteps and lighter hearts. I stood in our team's end-of-year photo, arms around 2 new hires. I felt proud, not for what I'd built, but for what we now stood for. This wasn't a throne, it was a platform. Evelyn's framed note behind us read, "Seen, heard, safe." I whispered it aloud. Not for the camera, but for me. Years ago, I was invisible. Now I was the light others gathered around. I wasn't just surviving, I was steady, solid enough. I revisited the empty family building one last time. Just bricks and echoes now. No ghosts. I touched the doorframe, where my name was once scraped off. I didn't feel rage, just distance. The space no longer held me. That was growth. Reflection isn't rage revisited, it's quiet separation. I walked out backward, not in fear, but in respect for the past. Then I turned forward toward something bigger, something truly mine, and left it behind for good. In my office, I replaced my old degree with a photo of our mentorship circle. Every face smiling. That shift mattered. I wasn't chasing accolades anymore. I was nurturing legacy. Evelyn's quote beneath it read, "What lasts is who we lift." I felt the weight leave my shoulders, the pressure to prove dissolved. Reflection wasn't a mirror, it was a window. And from mine, I saw clarity, not who I was then, but who I chose now. I spoke at a trauma recovery workshop. Not as a survivor, but as someone who rebuilt after neglect. I told them, "You can't wait for apologies to begin healing." Heads nodded. One woman cried. That's when I realized my voice wasn't just for me. It was a map, a path through the silence others still lived in. Reflection wasn't an echo, it was a direction. And I'd become the compass I once begged the world to be. During a solo hike, I reached a ridge Evelyn once loved. Her initials were still carved into the bench. I sat, breathed, and whispered, I made it, not in grandeur but in wholeness. Reflection showed me the climb wasn't about proving worth. It was about shedding weight, letting go. Evelyn had never needed me to succeed. She needed me to see myself. And now finally I did. Not perfectly, but enough to keep walking, unburdened, unshaken. Home, I hosted our first alumni event. Former staff, interns, partners. One guest said, "Your company gave me back my voice." That stuck. I hadn't just built a business, I'd built safe space. That's what reflection revealed, not a triumph of profit, but of presence. Years ago, I was denied voice, value, visibility. Now I gave it freely. That's the revolution. The real inheritance. A place where silence ends, and every story begins with belief, not proof. I signed the deed for our new headquarters, glass walls, open floors. Sunlight flooding every corner, no shadows, no corners to hide in. This wasn't just growth, it was rebirth. Evelyn's quote was etched into the entry, "Make it yours," and we did. This building wasn't a fortress, it was a garden. Everyone who entered carried a piece of the story. And now, we didn't just survive the silence, we filled it with voices that mattered. At our first open house, community members toured the space. One visitor paused at a mural we'd commissioned, portraits of team members who rose from rejection. "This feels like home." She said, that was it. Not office, not empire home. A space not defined by hierarchy but by healing. Evelyn's photo hung near the entrance. Underneath it, for those who dared to rebuild. I didn't just reclaim legacy. I rewrote it with every open door and raised voice. I launched a grant in Evelyn's name funding young entrepreneurs from broken systems. First Wardy hugged me, said, this changes everything. That's when I realized the full circle wasn't revenge, it was redistribution. Of belief, of power, of space. Evelyn had handed me keys when I had nothing. Now I passed them on not as charity but as inheritance. My family had gates, I built bridges. That was the message: your pain isn't your prison, it can be your platform. One quiet evening, I walked the office alone. Lights dimmed, keyboard silent. I stopped by the reflection wall. Staff leave gratitude notes there. One read, thank you for proving safe leadership exists. My throat tightened. This wasn't just redemption, it was revolution. Every day I showed up, I rewrote my family's story not with shame, but with choice. They taught control. I chose care. And the results. Not just success, legacy without fear, power without pain, home without hierarchy. On the company's anniversary, I stood beside a new intern who asked, what was your biggest lesson? I smiled, that you don't need to wait for someone else's seat, you can build your own table. Evelyn's seat, her wisdom still held space here. But now, the table had expanded, new voices, new dreams, and mine, no longer shaking, no longer silenced, just steady. I didn't just find peace, I forged it, and now, it feeds everyone who arrives hungry. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to check out more stories on my channel.